Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the podcast that takes, those really dense academic papers and makes them surprisingly interesting. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
We're diving into something pretty fascinating today, a paper that's actually part of the session readings for the virtual summer school in entrepreneurship research. And this year is, 2025.
Oh, wow, 2025.
That means this is the fifth year of this, it's a no-fee summer school. So
that's amazing.
It's a really incredible program. And, it started back in 2021, really shows you there's huge interest globally in, digging into the research side of entrepreneurship. So, yeah, we should give a big shout out to the folks behind it.
Definitely.
Professor Vishal K. Gupta and PhD candidate Athena Skiadopoulou. They're both from the University of Alabama. And their vision, for creating this program and keeping it accessible, that's invaluable. So
absolutely.
Hats off to them for fostering, this great learning environment for everybody.
Yeah.
So, okay, for our deep dive today, we're going to be looking at the sort of the intellectual journey of research on social entrepreneurship. And the study we're looking at today uses a really interesting combination of what's called bibliometric analysis.
Okay.
So it's like, think of it as analyzing trends in publications, so looking at the data.
Right.
But they've also paired that with a really thorough review of some of the key articles, the ones that have really shaped the field.
Makes sense.
So essentially, they looked at like a huge amount of research, right?
Yeah.
To see how those big conversations around social entrepreneurship, how they've changed and grown over time, and then they've zoomed in on the landmark papers that have really been driving those changes. And so for you, our listener, this is like getting the highlights reel. You're getting the essential insights into like how this field is actually developed, but without having to spend months in the library yourself.
Yeah, no kidding.
So we're going to be pulling out those key shifts, the current thinking, and even some ideas about where the research might be headed next in this area, because it's a dynamic, it's an evolving field.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's jump in. First off, the scale of this study is pretty impressive. 2,517 articles. And get this, 155,846 references. So that's a lot of data to sift through. And they looked at all this across three distinct periods. 1990 to 2009, then 2010 to 2014, and then finally 2015 to 2020.
Okay, so they're really trying to get a sense of this long view, right? To see how these ideas have progressed over time.
Exactly, yeah.
Like so.
And with those three phases, it's a really smart way to kind of track those core questions and how the approaches have shifted.
Yeah.
So, from all that data, what were some of their, big picture findings?
Well, so their bibliometric analysis, where they're looking at all those publications, it actually helped them to identify what they called clusters within each of those periods. And you can think of these clusters as representing, the main philosophical underpinnings of the research that was happening or like the core sets of ideas that were coming up at different points in time. So they actually found 13 of these clusters in the earliest period, and then that number shifted to 9 in the middle period, and then back up to 11 in the most recent one.
So almost like different schools of thought or, the dominant areas of inquiry that researchers were kind of like clustering around in each of those eras.
Exactly. Yeah, it's more like, what are the dominant questions being asked? And so that shift, from 13 to 9, it could suggest maybe like a consolidation of ideas as the field kind of matured and maybe certain approaches gained more traction. And to really dig in further, they also did a detailed review of I think it was the 106 recent articles, but like very influential articles. And this helped them pinpoint those major themes that are currently shaping, the whole conversation around social entrepreneurship research.
So they did the big data analysis to see the trends.
Right.
But then also a really close reading of these key texts to understand, like, okay, what's the substance of these trends?
Exactly.
There's ultimately, what's the big outcome? What's the main framework they've developed with all this?
So the culmination of their work was this really interesting organizing framework for future research. And it's got 6 key dimensions that they're suggesting are really fruitful avenues to explore going forward. So the 6 dimensions are ethics, individual, community, collaborative, organizational, and contextual.
Okay, so this is really useful. It's almost like a roadmap of where the field might be going.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's kind of rewind a bit, right? Let's go back to those past advances, the initial period from 1990 to 2009. So what were some of the fundamental questions that researchers were kind of wrestling with back then?
Yeah, so back then, it was really about, establishing that shared understanding of what social entrepreneurship actually is. It wasn't just about doing good, it was about like a distinct approach, one that blended social aims with, in some form, a business logic. And landmark works like Deasy's work in 1998 and Bornstein's book in 2007, they were really influential in that initial conceptualization.
So really laying the foundation, defining that core concept. And, as these ventures started to kind of mix those traditional nonprofit goals with, generating revenue, did questions around their legitimacy start to come up? Like, were these new organizations actually seen as credible, given this kind of dual mission?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because social enterprises were kind of, venturing into this territory that blurred the lines between, traditional charity and business, legitimacy became a huge concern. Scholars like Dart in 2004 and Dease again in 1998, they really address these challenges head on. The need for social enterprises to be seen as both effective in achieving their social goals and sound in their operational practices.
Right, so navigating that space between the not-for-profit and the for-profit. So in those early days, how did the broader environment, the institutions, the norms, how did those kinds of things influence the development of social enterprises?
Yeah, I mean, early research also recognized that those broader institutional forces, things like government regulations, social norms, and those established ways of organizing businesses and charities, they all played a significant role in how social enterprises could even emerge and operate. Thinkers like DiMaggio and Powell in 1983 and even, Friedman in 1962, they provided these frameworks to really understand those wider influences on how organizations develop.
So it's not just about the vision of the individual social entrepreneur, but also the landscape that they're trying to build within.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And I remember the idea of market failure being linked to the rise of social entrepreneurship. Yeah. How did that perspective kind of fit into this early stage?
Yeah, that was another key lens that researchers were using to view social entrepreneurship back then. And the core idea was that, social enterprises, they often emerge and they thrive by addressing those needs in society that traditional markets just aren't meeting very effectively. Mm-hmm. Thompson in 2002, Venkataraman in 97, they both touched on this. They were saying, social entrepreneurship is filling these gaps, responding to these failures in the market.
Filling the voids where traditional businesses and maybe even government efforts are falling short.
Yeah.
Now, one of the inherent balancing acts, it seems to me, with social enterprises is that whole role of profit.
Right.
Yeah. Was that kind of a contentious point, a debated point in that early research?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that tension between the need for financial sustainability, which, often involves some level of profit, and the traditional, voluntary or nonprofit ethos that was a big discussion. Works by, Foster and Braddock in 2005 and Sullivan Mort and colleagues in 2003, they explored that delicate balance. Can an organization really pursue a social mission while also, actively seeking profit?
Yeah, that's the fundamental question.
Yeah.
And so as researchers were kind of grappling with these, definitions and principles, were there initial attempts to kind of understand how these social enterprises actually functioned, like their business models, for example?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, those initial attempts to define the unique business models of social enterprises and to figure out how those models actually lead to positive change.
Right.
That was emerging then. Papers by Alvord and colleagues in 2004, Seelos and Mayer in 2005, they were crucial in those early explorations of how social enterprises create and capture value, both social and economic.
So moving beyond just defining what it is to really understanding how it operates and generates impact.
Yeah.
And at what point did the entrepreneurship part of social entrepreneurship really come into focus in the research?
Yeah, I mean, the field definitely started incorporating that entrepreneurship element more explicitly as it matured. Influential works by Mayer and Marty in 2006, and even going back to Shane and Venkataraman's work, more broadly on entrepreneurship in 2000, they began to highlight those entrepreneurial processes. The innovation, the risk taking, the opportunity seeking, all the things that are also central to social ventures.
So really connecting it to that well-established field of entrepreneurship,
Yeah.
and showing how those principles apply in this social context.
Yeah.
What about the organizations themselves? I mean, were researchers looking at what made social enterprises distinct from traditional nonprofit organizations?
Yeah, definitely. There was a growing body of research that was, focused on identifying this distinctive characteristics of social enterprises and how they were kind of evolving beyond the traditional nonprofit model. Austin and colleagues, their work in 2006, they were directly comparing social and commercial entrepreneurship.
Right.
Pointing out similarities, but also those crucial differences. And Leadbeater, in his work in 97, he was really talking about this rise of social enterprise as like a fundamentally new approach to addressing social needs.
So kind of a more like business-oriented toolkit for tackling these societal problems. And finally, in that kind of origination period, were researchers also starting to look at the individuals behind these ventures? The motivations, the backgrounds of social entrepreneurs.
Definitely. Early research also started to delve into, the motivations, the values, the career paths of the people who are choosing to, start and lead these social enterprises. Studies by, Harman and colleagues in 1994, Holland in 1997, they provided some initial frameworks for understanding those personal drivers, those unique characteristics of social entrepreneurs.
It's fascinating to see how those foundational questions, for the field were being laid out.
Yeah.
So now let's shift to the current trends.
Yeah. Right.
Let's look at that intermediate period, 2010 to 2014, and then the later period, 2015 to 2020. So what were some of the big changes in the research focus?
Yeah, in those more recent periods, we saw a really significant shift towards more in-depth theoretical development. So, instead of mostly focusing on, defining and describing social entrepreneurship, there was this growing emphasis on building these more robust theories to explain, why and how it works. Papers by Dassin and colleagues in 2010, Santos in 2012, they really exemplify that move towards more sophisticated theoretical frameworks. It's kind of like going from just naming the parts of an engine to really understanding how they interact and make the whole thing run.
So moving beyond just identifying the phenomenon to really like getting at the underlying mechanisms and principles.
Yeah.
And the concept of a social enterprise as a hybrid organization, that seems to have become, incredibly important during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. That idea that social enterprises are simultaneously pursuing both a social mission and some kind of, commercial activity, that became like a dominant and very central theme. Landmark works by Badalona and Dorado in 2010, Pache and Santos in 2013. They really solidified this idea that social enterprises are inherently hybrid. They're juggling these potentially competing logics.
That dual nature, that constant balancing act.
Yeah.
And even with this increasing focus on theory, were there still ongoing debates about the fundamental definition of social entrepreneurship itself?
Yeah, surprisingly, those conceptual debates around how to precisely define it actually continued, even as more theoretical work was being developed. Scholars like Choi and Majumdar in 2014, and even revisiting DA's original 1998 definition, it just showed that the field was still really actively trying to refine that core understanding, which is interesting. It's a testament to the complexity and the evolving nature of the phenomenon itself.
So it's a field that's kind of in constant dialogue with itself, continuously seeking greater clarity. And you mentioned those challenges inherent in being a hybrid organization.
Yeah.
Did the research actually start to look at how social enterprises navigate those inherent tensions?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as the hybridity model, gained traction and acceptance, research started to really dig into the specific challenges and complexities that arise, from trying to pursue these dual goals, social and commercial goals within the same organization. Studies by Badalona and colleagues in 2017, Smith and Besharov in 2019, they were really getting into how social enterprises actually manage those competing demands and develop organizational strategies to cope with those inherent tensions.
So how they balance those potentially conflicting priorities within the same structure.
Yeah.
And that sounds incredibly complex.
Yeah.
Now, you also noted a growing emphasis on ethics in social entrepreneurship research, particularly in the later period. What kind of spurred that increased focus?
Yeah, that's a really interesting and important development. While ethical considerations were probably there, implicitly in the early discussions, the later period sought a much more explicit and growing appreciation for the specific ethical dimensions of social entrepreneurship. So, scholars like Schell and colleagues in 2016, Day and Steyert also in 2016, they were directly tackling those unique ethical challenges and considerations that social enterprises face, as they're pursuing both social and economic value creation.
So as the field matured, and more real world examples emerged, maybe those ethical complexities and potential trade-offs just became more apparent.
Exactly.
More attention was needed.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned some specific longitudinal trends that this study identified.
Yes.
So over time, can you walk us through some of those key shifts in focus?
Yeah, absolutely. One really notable trend was, as we just discussed, that increasing and more explicit focus on the ethics of social entrepreneurship as the field evolved. Yeah. Initially there might have been this tendency to assume that social just inherently meant ethical, but over time a more critical and nuanced examination of the ethical aspects emerged.
Right, so not taking the ethical dimension for granted.
Exactly.
What other significant shifts in research emphasis did they observe?
Another big one was a shift away from mostly emphasizing the external context, like the societal needs or the institutional environment, and a move towards exploring the internal organizational dynamics. So early on, the focus was maybe more outward looking, but later on, researchers increasingly turned their attention to what was happening inside the social enterprise itself.
Right.
The structures, the processes, the culture.
So an inward turn, looking more at those internal workings.
Yeah.
What about the actors involved? Did the lens of the research change in terms of who or what was being studied?
Yeah. Initially, the emphasis was often on those social entrepreneurs as individual leaders. Their personal traits, their motivations, their unique skills, and then over time, the focus kind of broadened to look more at social enterprises as organizations, as these collective entities, with their own strategies and challenges and organizational identities.
From the individual visionary to the organization as a whole system.
Exactly, yeah.
That makes sense as the field develops and more established social enterprises start to emerge. So throughout this evolution of research, how has social entrepreneurship been conceptualized in relation to traditional commercial entrepreneurship?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. The study found a fairly consistent conceptualization across all three of those time periods. It's consistently been seen as distinct but related.
Okay.
Sharing some core elements, but with that fundamental addition of a primary social mission. So
that comparative lens has kind of been a constant.
Yeah. It has.
Were there any points where the lines seemed to blur significantly?
While that core distinction based on the social mission, remained, the increasing use of those business models and revenue generation by social enterprises,
right,
it did lead to discussions about those boundaries,
Yep.
where they lie and how to best categorize these hybrid forms.
Yeah, so the comparative lens helps to highlight, I guess, both the unique aspects, but also the shared kind of entrepreneurial DNA.
Exactly.
What about the financial aspect?
Yeah.
You've mentioned revenue generation.
Sure.
How did that evolve as a core element in the research?
Yeah, the integration of revenue generation as a central and accepted aspect of social enterprises really solidified over time, and that was largely driven by that increasing acceptance and study of the hybridity perspective. Mm. So what might have started as a pragmatic necessity for survival gradually became recognized as a fundamental characteristic, and a key element in their potential for sustainability and scale. So it went from maybe being a secondary consideration to really being like a core part of the definition.
Interesting.
And how we understand these organizations.
So it became much more central to how they're defined and understood.
Yeah, exactly.
You touched on the concept of legitimacy earlier, in our discussion of that initial period.
Right.
How did that concern around legitimacy kind of shift over time according to the study?
Yeah, so the importance of legitimacy as a research topic actually went through some interesting ebbs and flows.
Okay.
It was a big concern in the early days, as we said, as these organizations were kind of charting this new territory between nonprofit and for-profit models. And then, during that intermediate period, as those earned income strategies, they became more widely accepted within the social sector, legitimacy kind of seemed to become less of a central focus.
Okay.
But then it resurfaced again. In the most recent period with the rise of that hybrid organization model.
Right.
And it brought with it, new questions about accountability, about, potential mission drift,
right,
and how these organizations balance those dual goals, in the eyes of their stakeholders.
So the rise of the hybrid model brought with it, it's almost like a second wave of legitimacy concern.
Yeah, exactly. Can they really be both socially impactful and financially sustainable without compromising,
Yeah.
their core values. So it's an interesting cycle.
Yeah. What emerged as like a truly dominant and really influential area of research in those later periods? Like what really captured the attention of scholars?
Yeah, the study really highlights that hybridity emerged as that dominant and very influential area. Understanding the complexities, the challenges, and the opportunities,
right,
associated with these blended organizations, that became a central point of research in the field.
So it really sounds like it's kind of the linchpin that connects a lot of the current thinking in social entrepreneurship research.
Yeah, I think so.
And finally, in terms of how the research is actually conducted, did the study notice any significant shifts in the methodologies being used over time?
Yeah, there was a really notable methodological shift. So the early research was predominantly conceptual, focused on defining those key terms and developing those initial frameworks, laying that theoretical groundwork. But as the field matured and more real world examples of social enterprises became available, there was a very clear and significant move towards incorporating more qualitative methodologies.
Okay.
And this allowed researchers to really go deeper into the nuances of how social entrepreneurship operates in practice.
Yeah.
Exploring those lived experiences and complex dynamics within those organizations.
Yeah, so moving from that foundational, theory building to more in-depth, empirical studies, really trying to understand those complexities on the ground.
Exactly, yeah.
So with this rich understanding of how social entrepreneurship research has evolved, what key directions does this study kind of point to for the future of inquiry?
Yeah, so drawing on their extensive bibliometric analysis and that structured review of all those influential articles, the research suggests that future research can be really fruitful if it's guided by those 6 key dimensions that we outlined earlier. The ethics, the individual, the community, collaborative, organizational, and contextual. And it's a helpful roadmap for thinking about where the field might be headed.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just briefly touch on each of those dimensions to give you, our listener, a little bit of a glimpse into what that potential future landscape of research could look like. So starting with ethics.
Yeah.
What could future research kind of explore there?
Yeah, in the realm of ethics, future research could really explore those specific ethical challenges and dilemmas that come up, when social enterprises are trying to balance their social and commercial objectives. How do they navigate potential trade-offs? How do ethical considerations evolve as those ventures grow and scale? What new ethical questions might emerge as the field develops?
Yeah, these are crucial questions, especially as social enterprises gain more influence and resources. So that ethical tightrope that they walk really deserves continued scrutiny. So what about the individual dimension? What might researchers focus on there?
Yeah, with the individual dimension, future research could dig deeper into understanding how social entrepreneurs actually identify the social opportunities that they pursue.
Yeah.
What role does their motivation play? Their values, their prior experiences. How do they learn and adapt as their ventures evolve? Really understanding the agency and the characteristics of the individuals who are driving these innovations that that remains a vital area to explore.
And the community dimension, that seems like a particularly relevant one, for understanding the impact of social enterprises, kind of on the ground. Yeah. What are some of the potential research avenues there?
Yeah, for the community dimension, future research might focus on how social enterprises actually engage with those local communities that they're aiming to serve. How do they navigate, cultural nuances? How do they build trust? How can we measure the social value that they create at that community level? And the role of existing social capital within communities and how social enterprises interact with and maybe leverage that's another really important area to look at.
So understanding that link between the social enterprise and the social fabric of the community that it operates within.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, what about the collaborative dimension?
Yeah, given that a lot of the complex social problems that social enterprises address really require that collective action, the collaborative dimension, it suggests exploring the nature and effectiveness of collaborations between social enterprises and other types of organizations, for-profit businesses, traditional nonprofits, governmental agencies. What are the things that motivate those different partnerships? What are the challenges in maintaining a clear social mission, within those collaborative endeavors, and how can these collaborations be structured to really maximize their impact?
So really, understanding how social enterprises can leverage those partnerships to amplify their reach.
Exactly.
What about the organizational dimension, which we've seen has had some significant research attention more recently?
Yeah. With that organizational dimension, future research can continue to examine how social enterprises, especially those hybrid organizations that we've talked about, how they respond to those often complex and sometimes conflicting demands from their various stakeholders. How do they mobilize those different resources they need? How does the very nature of their hybridity evolve over time as they grow? Yeah. And what are the the key drivers and barriers that influence their growth and their sustainability?
So really kind of delving deeper into the inner workings and the life cycle of these unique organizational forms.
Yeah.
And then finally the contextual dimension, which seems pretty crucial for understanding the nuances of social entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
Across different settings. The
contextual dimension really it underscores that importance of recognizing that social entrepreneurship doesn't happen in a vacuum. So future research really needs to keep exploring how that specific environment, the formal laws and regulations, but also the informal cultural norms and values, how those things significantly influence the creation of a social enterprise, its activities, and its ultimate success. There's also a great opportunity to explore, the dynamics of social entrepreneurship in emerging economies and other diverse contexts around the world.
So recognizing that what works in one context may not, translate directly to another.
Right. Yeah.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, what are some of the really key takeaways, from our exploration into this evolution of social entrepreneurship research?
Well, we've traced a really interesting journey, from those initial efforts to define what social entrepreneurship is, to understand the role of the individual social entrepreneur, to this much more sophisticated understanding of the social enterprise as a hybrid organization, navigating these really complex ethical and operational landscapes. And looking ahead, that future research agenda is really rich and it promises to offer even deeper insights into how these ventures can effectively create social value across those diverse contexts.
Yeah, for you, our listener, we hope this has provided a valuable shortcut, a way to kind of, gain a structured understanding of a complex and evolving field, and to really highlight those really important, nuggets of information without having to go through, thousands of pages of academic research yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it really prompts us all to kind of consider which of those potential research directions is most interesting to you. What are the pressing questions about social entrepreneurship that you feel still need the most urgent investigation in our rapidly changing world? And maybe even think about, a specific social issue that you really care about and how these evolving research perspectives might offer new and innovative ways to address it. And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.